Greetings, I'm Pastor Diana Thompson. I serve as the interim pastor at St. John's Lutheran Church, New Franklin, Minerva, Ohio, and the administrative pastor at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Alliance, Ohio. Welcome to the 33rd episode of the Bible study of the Gospel according to Luke. It is my joy to have you join me in this video. I hope that you find it life-giving, spiritually enlightening, inspirational. As we get ready to get into this, I encourage you to have 3 items with you. 1, a Bible, a translation of your choice, and it can be a printed version or a digital version, so whatever works for you in that way, whatever you have available. And then I also encourage you to have a pad of paper or a notebook and a pen or pencil to jot down your thoughts or ideas. If you are using your personal Bible, it's a printed version. You're welcome to make notes in your Bible if that's where you'd prefer to do that for later reference. But I would encourage you to have those tools. Sometimes something sparks in our head or there's a question, and if I don't answer it, you can always send it to me later. At the end of the video, you'll see all my contact information, both social media and email. You're also welcome to drop your questions in the comments below this video, and I'll do my best to answer them for you. But I'm excited that you're here. I'm so glad that you joined me today. We, as I said, are in the 33rd episode. So if you've just randomly found this, I invite you to go back to my YouTube channel. All the available episodes are there. You can, pick and choose, or you can work through them from the beginning. That's up to you. So we, in today's episode, are going to explore chapter 14 of the Gospel of Luke. I know in the last episode I said I don't think we'd get all the way through 14, but I think for the cohesiveness of the unit, we're going to try to do all of chapter 14 because it all works together, what Jesus is doing as a cohesive whole. So we are going to look at Jesus healing a man with dropsy in chapter 14, verses 1 through 6. Jesus talking about humility and hospitality in verses 7 through 14. The parable of the great dinner in verses 15 through 24. And the conditions for discipleship in chapter 20, in verses 25 through 35. And then also that includes, Jesus talking about being salt. So it's very interesting what he goes through in this chapter. But I think for its cohesiveness, it'll be good if we can get through the whole chapter in this episode. I want to remind us of the themes that run throughout the Gospel of Luke and in the book of Acts because they all connect together. We may see some of these themes, we may see all of these themes, but I wanted to bring them up to us once again. So the first is God's redemptive purposes. Second, salvation for all alike. Third, the blessings of poverty and the dangers of wealth. 4, table fellowship. 5, the role of a disciple. And 6, the importance of an accurate witness. So those are the themes that run throughout the Gospel of Luke. Again, not every story touches on all of those, but we'll come back later and see what Luke was emphasizing in our stories today. As I mentioned in the last episode, chapter 13 and 14 are actually parallels of each other. Last session, Jesus healed the story of the crippled woman, and today he heals a man with dropsy. And then it's followed by parables and teachings, and finally closes with a discussion of the cost of following God's will. So first, let us enter into chapter 14, verses 1 through 6. Jesus heals the man with dropsy. So a little bit of background in this section. Jesus is invited to dine at the home of one of the Pharisees, and it floats us back to Luke 5, chapter 5, verses 29 through 39, chapter 7, verse 36 through 50, and then chapter 11, verses 37 to 54. So Jesus gets invited to these dinners with Pharisees, but they always seem to end in some sort of controversy. This scene is distinctive, though, that it takes place. What happens here is Jesus is healing on the Sabbath, but rather than healing in the synagogue, he's actually healing at a man's home, at a Pharisee's home. So there's something different about this. It takes place at a meal. But we'll see throughout all of this particular chapter that meal and hospitality and caring for neighbors runs throughout these themes. But the key issue that parallels what we saw in chapter 13 is that whether a person's healing takes precedent over the Sabbath observance of doing no work. So let's read through these verses. We're in chapter 14, starting at verse 1 and going through verse 6. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. Just then in front of him there was a man who had dropsy. And Jesus asked the lawyers and Pharisees, "Is it lawful to cure people on the Sabbath or not?" But they were silent. So Jesus took him and healed him and sent him away. Then he said to them, "If one of you had a child or an ox that had fallen into a well, would you not immediately pull it out on the Sabbath day?" And they could not reply to this. So a little bit of background. Eating is a significant social occasion. Guests were accepted as equals, and Jesus might understandably have been watched closely to see whether he would follow the prescribed norms of etiquette, which allowed both the guest and the host to be honored. A meal with a distinguished guest, such as a prophet or a teacher, would also have been an occasion for conversation. That might have been serious, witty, or both. So the reference to the meal, to eat bread, is reminiscent of other stories that we have where Jesus gathers to share with one another. So let's go back to the story about this healing. The encounter of the man with dropsy starts exactly the same way as the story of the stooped woman, which we saw in chapter 11. All of a sudden, there was a person in front of him. Now, the narrator does not explain whether this man was a guest or a bystander, but dropsy or edema was an abnormal accumulation in the body and usually a symptom of serious physical problems. So you might know the word edema because we use that now in our language. So abnormal accumulation of fluid in the body. But usually it is a symptom of something bigger. Something else is going on, a heart issue, whatever reason you're retaining fluids you shouldn't be retaining. So this is the third healing on the Sabbath. So Luke kind of abbreviates this story. He doesn't go into a long explanation of it being the Sabbath or anything of that nature. He just names that it's the Sabbath. And notice there's no dialogue with the man in this story, unlike the woman in chapter 13. Or were there questioning by the Pharisees? Instead, Jesus poses the question of whether it is allowable to heal on the Sabbath. As we've seen before, lawyers and Pharisees have been characterized by Luke as those who reject God's purpose. So the question here, the first of two questions Jesus will pose, is it lawful to cure people on the Sabbath or not? Of course, the question in its simplicity implies an affirmative answer for modern readers, right? Is it lawful or not? Well, your instinct says yes, it's lawful, it's acceptable. Yet, even in its simplicity, it doesn't assume that the Pharisees would agree. Now remember, the legal prescriptions regarding healing on the Sabbath have a lot to do with urgency, right? It is lawful to heal on the Sabbath if it is life and death. If it is a long-term or chronic illness, they should wait until another time to seek healing. So the fact that the lawyers and Pharisees were silent already implies what is going to happen at the end of the story is they really can't answer Jesus. They can't reply to this question. The healing is incidental to Jesus' two questions for the lawyers or Pharisees. It's reported with no fanfare and no response. I mean, think about it. In almost all of the other miracle stories, there's some response of awe or praise, either by the person who was healed or some of the crowd that was around it. But this time, there's no immediate response. Jesus merely heals the man and sends him on his way. The focus is Jesus' challenge to the lawyers and Pharisees and their response to Jesus. Now, I want you to understand that there's a variety of responses within the Jewish community at that time about whether one would be allowed to heal or rescue an animal. And so Jesus' second question is, he says, if one of you had a child or an ox that had fallen into a well, would you not immediately pull it out on the Sabbath day? Would you not do anything to save a life on the Sabbath day? Now, many of them would debate about whether you rescue an animal on the Sabbath. Is that worthy? But there's no argument about whether you would save a child. The life of a human being overrules the observances of work on the Sabbath. So Jesus in this story points out that bringing life, that saving life, overrides the observance of the Sabbath. Human need takes precedent over Sabbath observance. It is part of who Jesus is to bring life, to restore health, to show mercy and compassion. And the Sabbath observance is to help guide us as people of faith. It is not meant to prevent us from being healers and sharers of God's grace and love. It is meant to give us a guide for how we are to live. So Jesus once again emphasizes that he is powerful over the Sabbath, but also that he is the one that brings life and healing, and that the Sabbath is not enough of a reason to not bring life to another, to not restore life to another. So again, just as the woman who was healed in chapter 13 and the Pharisees and religious leaders were trying to argue with him, they didn't like that he was doing this and said, she could have come any other day. Why did she come today, and why did you do this? In this story, we don't get that dialogue, but Jesus emphasizes once again that human precedent, human need, and human protection takes precedent over our Sabbath observances. That the law is meant to help us, but it is not meant to prevent us from doing what God calls us to do and to be who God calls us to be. So again, in chapter 13, we had a healing followed by parables and teachings. We do the same thing in chapter 14. Jesus has two parables. One is about humility and hospitality, and the other is a parable about the great dinner. So we will start with Jesus teaching about humility and hospitality. And this is chapter 14, verses 7 through 14. When Jesus noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, give this person your place. And then in disgrace you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. I'm going to break here for just a quick minute, because the first part that we just read talks about the humility of the guest. What I'm going to read next talks about the hospitality of the host. So let's see how Jesus talks to the hosts of a gathering. Jesus also said to the one who had invited him, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, and you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." So this teaching about humility and hospitality are connected because it talks about how one behaves either as a guest or a host of a meal, of a gathering. And there's parallels, between these two teachings. So to the guests, he talks about when you are invited, right? And then to the host, he says when you give a dinner. So they're very much parallel. And I'm going to make a slide so you can see all of this because I think it's helpful to look at. And then it talks about where you sit or who you invite. And then finally, for the guest, it talks about being honored. For the host, it talks about being blessed. And then he closes each of them with an understanding that this is actually connected to the end of time, the eschatology. So there's a connection to these teachings to what it will be like at the end of time. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled. Those who you give a meal to who cannot repay you, you will be rewarded in the resurrection. So there's this strong parallel between the two. So let's first talk about Jesus' advice to guests. Now, Jesus' advice parallels a parable, and it reminds people to be shrewd, to not make fools of themselves and be set up for embarrassment. So when Jesus says, sit in the lowest place, so your host invites you to move up into more honored space, he really is talking about this. The first readers would have heard this as, oh, let's be shrewd. Let's do this out of, it's a game. It's a social game, right? If I sit in the lowest place, then my host will encourage me to move up. That I will have false humility. But Jesus actually says, no, you shouldn't do this out of a false humility. Instead, it really is about being humble and not assuming that you are the most important person in the gathering. But it also reflects back, remember how the haughty will be humbled and the lowly will be lifted up. This is the same parallel that we hear in Luke's, in Jesus reciting Isaiah, that the haughty will be lowered, the lowly will be lifted up. It's the same idea. That our honor is not something that we seize, that our place of status is not something that we claim for ourselves. It wouldn't be uncommon for people to do this as a social game, right? Ooh, let's play position, who's going to get what seat? Where do I fit in this social status and ranking? But Jesus is not coaching guests how to play the game to gain public recognition. Remember, he's not telling folks to just take a couple seats below the station where they think they'll be. He actually encourages them to take the lowest place, to truly be humble. The Christian readers and the early Christians would quickly remember that Jesus says the first will be last and the last will be first, from chapter 13, verse 30. And the other thing that we need to notice is that the word for honor is usually translated glory. And it points the hearer beyond the recognition that they may receive from the others present to the glory that belongs to God, that only God can give. So there's multiple layers playing out here. and then especially then when Jesus anchors it to the eschatological and end of time of judgment setting. So he's playing on this common experience that people are invited to gather at a family or friend's house, and there is this social jockeying for position at the table. But that's not what Jesus wants. Jesus wants them to understand that their situation, their reversal of value, is very different in God's kingdom. Humility is not something to be feigned as a strategy for recognition. Instead, humility is a quality of life open to persons who know that their worth is not measured by recognition from their peers, but in the certainty that God has accepted them. So again, it sounds like Jesus is saying, here's how you play this social game. But then he turns it, he twists it, and says, no, this is what it means to be a person of faith in the world. That you live in a place of humility because it's not what the world tells you about who you are. It's about who you are in God's eyes, in the presence of God. That God has accepted you, and your place is established in the final kingdom. And then he moves into how he advises hosts. And again, there's a deeper connection. He plays out the usual social standards, but he turns it and then connects it to the end of time when God's kingdom comes to its fullness. So, first of all, we need to be aware that hosts are no more free from the quest for recognition than their guests. The community and sharing of life and bread that takes place at a table is too sacred to be perverted for our private advantage. The word meal in verse 12 designates both the noontime meal, the luncheon, and the heavier meal, evening meal of a dinner. So Jesus lists 4 groups one should not invite. This is precisely the groups that are most often invited. Your friends, your siblings, your relatives, and your rich neighbors. Now think about this from Herod's banquet in Mark chapter 6, verse 21. These are exactly who Herod invites. And he balances that list with another list of 4 persons who are not welcome. They're not socially acceptable. Who does he say you should invite? The poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. Those who are outside of the social recognition, who are not perceived as valuable in the society. And he advises not to invite the powerful or the well-to-do because they might return the invitation. That there is an opportunity for them to repay you. That it's truly not a gift because it becomes a quid pro quo, right? You invite me, I invite you. We even have that social status now. We still do that. How many of you have received a present, a birthday present or a Christmas present, and you didn't buy something for that person for their birthday or for Christmas, and you feel this social failure, right? You were given a gift, but you didn't have something to give in return. We hold some of these same standards, and though we may not do it for meals, we do it in other ways. And it's a reminder that we still have this quid pro quo, right? A little for me, a little for you. We trade it back and forth. So when Jesus says, don't invite the people who could repay you, instead invite people who won't have the opportunity, who would be unable to, because then you're truly honored. And again, it reminds us that our honor is not based on our social status, that of our ability to invite people of economic or social status in this world, but instead to be so generous that we don't have to worry about being repaid, that we're not looking for social status in this world. but instead looking to what God will ultimately provide for us. Now notice that the parallel between the guests being honored and the host being blessed. At the end of time, when we understand our value in God's kingdom and not the world's values, we become honored and we become blessed. That God is the one who provides for us and whose blessing and praise truly matters. Now, it's introduced as a parable, this teaching about humility and hospitality. But really, it's more of sage advice. It's more of a wisdom piece because it's really not in the form of a parable. But what it teaches us and reminds us is that our status and value is not based on what the world tells us, but how God views us, our place in God's kingdom. Next, Jesus shares a true parable. It's the parable of the great dinner. One of the dinner guests, on hearing this, said to Jesus, "Blessed is anyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God." Then Jesus said to him, "Someone gave a great dinner and invited many. At the time for the dinner, he sent his slave to say to those who had invited, 'Come, for everything is ready now.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, 'I have bought a piece of land and I must go out and see it. Please accept my regrets.' Another said, 'I bought 5 yoke of oxen and I am going to try them out. Please accept my regrets.' Another said, 'I have just been married and therefore I cannot come.' So the slave returned and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry and said to his slave, 'Go out at once into the streets and the lanes of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame.' And the slave said, 'Sir, what you have ordered has been done and there is still room.' Then the master said to the slave, 'Go out into the roads and lanes and compel people to come in so that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those who were invited will taste my dinner.'" So once again, Luke, it reiterates that this is continuing to be in the meal that was described in verse 1 of chapter 14 and reintroduced in chapter 14. Jesus addresses his fellow guests and hosts in verses 7 through 11 and 12 through 14, but now he responds to one of the other guests at the table. The fellow guest has sensed that Jesus was speaking of the final banquet and joins him in affirming those who feast at the Lord's table are truly blessed. Or, feeling the embarrassment of the moment, the fellow guest has voiced a common platitude in an effort to ease the situation. We really aren't sure. So this parable assumes the custom and social stratifications of the ancient city. The host is obviously a wealthy person. He can afford to give a banquet. He invites people who are buying land and oxen, and he has a servant. The practice of a double invitation allows guests to verify that the proper arrangements were being made for the banquet and that the right people would be in attendance. So there was a first invitation, and then the servant is sent to tell them that all is ready. If the right people are not going to be there, they would decline. In this case, the man's banquet is snubbed. All the guests politely offer excuses, as if by some common assent, claiming they are unable to come. Now, I want you to notice the first 2 excuses are completely absurd. They observe the social function of declining the host's invitation, but no one would buy land without inspecting it, nor would anyone buy oxen unseen. Both of the first 2 excuses point to material possessions that hinder them from attending the coming banquet. Now, the third excuse could be read in various ways. Concern allows one's family to hinder one's response. Remember, Jesus says that family can get in the way of following. First, the response of the third guest violates the standard storyteller's device of having the third character in the sequence serve as a reversal of the pattern established by the first two. So people hearing this would have assumed that this third person would have responded, would have been the reversal from the first two, but instead Jesus continues this story of rejection. So he emphasizes that no one whom the host invited was willing to attend. But in all honesty, all of the excuses are pretenses. Possessions and family are preventing them from attending this banquet, from accepting this invitation. Remember, this is a parable. Now, where the first two asked to be excused, the third man flatly says he's unable to come. He is newly married. When the servant comes back and reports these outrageous excuses to the owner of the house, the owner is justifiably angry. He's been rejected by his social peers, so the owner of the house decides to reach out to the only other social group available to him: the poor, the cripple, the blind, the lame. Remember exactly who Jesus says hosts should be inviting? And by inviting such persons to his banquet, the snubbed host would also be issuing an insult to his family and friends. Their esteem and approval no longer mattered to him. He thumbed his nose at the social standards that defined their privileged social position. The list of those whom the servant should extend the invitation, as I mentioned, was identical to those that Jesus said we should invite. Again, the exalted are being brought down and the lowly are being lifted up. So the servant is sent into the broad streets and the narrow lanes to bring in the outcasts from all over the city. And after the servant does that, there's still room available, so the master sends him out a second time. And the second invitation matches the first two invitations that had been extended to the original guest list. Now, this might be a foreshadowing of the preaching of the gospel first to the Jews and then to the Gentiles, that there's this first invitation to the Jewish community, and then the second invitation is to an even larger audience. The key here is the master is determined to fill his house, so that all of those who were originally invited and rejected could no longer attend. The parable ends with the master's pronouncement. His servant has spoken, the invited guests have spoken, and the master has spoken to the servant. The only persons who are poor, crippled, blind, and lame, and those in the roads and lanes remain without a voice. But it is those with no voice, no place, and no social standing who in the end will dine with the master. And this is the point of the whole story. This parable mirrors the warning in chapter 13, 22 through 30. In the first half of this extended section is the reversal that will accompany the coming of the kingdom of God. Many who presume they will be included will find themselves excluded, and their place will be taken by the outcasts. The future will not be a continuation of the present, but will be a reversal of exclusionary and discriminatory social codes. The lawyers and the Pharisees who had been invited to the meal had jockeyed for position of honor. In Jesus' parable, those who are concerned with their honor will exclude themselves from the master's banquet, and their place will be taken by those who exclude no one on the basis of their social standing. When we assume we have a place, that we don't have to worry about being distracted by other things, we are falling exactly into what this parable teaches. The people refused the invitation because they were distracted by possessions. They were distracted by family obligations. They were distracted by the things of this world and refused to attend the banquet and accept the invitation. As we've said many times, those who assumed that they were automatically included are the ones that Jesus warns have the most to lose. The Pharisees, the lawyers, the scribes, those who say we have done everything we know we are in, are the ones that Jesus is cautioning and saying, do not assume that you are in. Do not assume that you have a place if you don't accept the invitation that I offer you to come and follow me. It's a challenge because it is so easy for us to be distracted. There are so many things in the world that can pull us away from following the invitation, from accepting the invite to the final banquet. Will we come? Will we join in this amazing gift? As in chapter 13, chapter 14 continues with these conditions for discipleship. In verses 25 through 35, Jesus talks about the cost of discipleship. In chapter 13, he talked about what it would cost him, right? That it would cost him his life, that he must go to Jerusalem, and though he lamented that Jerusalem would take his life, he went because it was what God called him to do. Now, Jesus talks to his disciples and those who follow him. We are in chapter 14, verses 25 through 35. Now large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and he turned and said to them, whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he had laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, this fellow began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king, going out to wage war against another king, will not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If he cannot, then, while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for the terms of peace. So therefore, none of you can become my disciples if you do not give up all your possessions. Jesus continues, salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. They throw it away. Let anyone with ears to hear listen. This story parallels chapter 13, verses 31 through 35, where Jesus laments the failure of Jerusalem to respond to Jesus' call. As a conclusion of chapter 14, we now contemplate the danger that many would-be disciples will fail to meet the conditions of true discipleship. Luke returned to the journey motif, leaving behind the meal setting. Because Jesus faces martyrdom in Jerusalem, his followers must be prepared to leave everything behind and make their commitment to Jesus as complete and all-consuming as Jesus' own devotion to his ministry. These sayings are directed to the large crowd that follows Jesus, and their intent is to urge persons who are seeking to be disciples to first consider the demands of discipleship. How often do we consider the demands of discipleship? What have we done to reflect on what God might call us to do? So there's 3 conditions laid down in this sequence of pronouncements. One concerning family ties that would prevent one from being disciples, bearing one's cross, and forsaking possessions. Remember, some of those were some of the same things about why people rejected coming to the banquet that was in the parable just before, right? Family ties and forsaking possessions. Now the third one is bearing one's cross, which Jesus did not discuss in the previous parable. I want us to look at verse 26. Jesus' ethic of love makes it unthinkable that one should hate his or her own family. And verse 26 has always been a difficult saying for us. So there's two things that help us put this into context. First, Jesus is practicing hyperbole, exaggerating a contrast that can be to make it seen more clearly. So hate does not mean anger or hostility. It indicates that if there is a conflict, one's response to the demands of discipleship must take precedence over even the most sacred of human relationships. There is no duty higher than commitment to Jesus and being his disciple. And then the second part is that there's a very practical function in the lives of the first Christians. In the Gospels, we see the disciples as an itinerant band. It has been suggested that this portrait reflects the situation of the earliest Christians. Discipleship required a willingness to leave home and family and travel with minimal provisions from village to village in order to proclaim the gospel. Even later in Corinth, the church faced the problems caused by pagan spouses divorcing their believing partners. The addition of the words, even life itself, at the end of the lists of one's family members echoes the sayings about forsaking one's life. So then in verse 27, Jesus talks about bearing one's cross. This saying evokes again the rejection of Jesus and the suffering that awaits him in Jerusalem. He warns the crowd that no one can follow him unless they are willing and ready to share the same fate as Jesus, to participate in his suffering. So in this version of the saying, Jesus is not speaking of taking up one's cross, but of bearing it, just as Jesus bore his cross as well. In verses 28 through 32, we might actually even think about these parables as a subtitle called Fools at Work and at War. These parables have no other references in any of the other Gospels. Jesus draws attention to a simple observance. A prudent person would not begin a project until they were sure they could complete it, whether it was a man building a tower or a king going to war. So by the same token, God has not entered a redemptive process without being prepared to complete it. And Jesus did not set his face to Jerusalem without being prepared to face the sacrifice that would be required of him. With that in mind, the disciples need to be prepared to forsake everything for the sake of following Jesus. Now note, these parables move from the lesser to the greater consequence. Remember, Luke uses this in a lot of places. In the first, the threat is merely to be embarrassed before one's neighbors because one could not complete their tower. But the second, the consequence of defeat at the hands of an enemy, is huge. The parable does not advocate building stronger armies, but only to illustrate the folly of embarking on an adventure without being sure one can see it through. So in verse 33, we see that these parables lead to the third condition. They demand that one be ready to give up everything to be a disciple. If you seek to follow Jesus, then understand first what is required is all you have. So when applying this to one's personal material possessions, Luke often does as we see in verse 33. He concludes and returns with a refrain, "None of you can become my disciples if you do not give up all of your possessions." The verb that translates to give up literally means to say farewell or to take leave of. The description of sharing goods in the early church in the book of Acts chapter 2 and chapter 4 illustrate that Jesus understood that one would surrender all one's possession to the greater community. I think for us in our modern world, and especially in the North American context, that giving up all of one's possessions would probably be the most difficult thing that we would be asked to do. To be ready at any time to surrender all that we have to go where Jesus calls us. It's not easy. It's not easy because we are trained to protect ourselves, to prepare for our future, to plan for tragedy. And Jesus says, to be his disciples, you must be ready to give up all that you have, all your possessions, to walk away from family conflict, to be the disciple that Christ calls you. These are not easy words for us, and I invite you to spend some time pondering what that looks like in your life. Jesus concludes this teaching with sayings about salt, and it's really a warning for those who are already disciples. Value of salt lies in its salinity. So if it doesn't have its saltiness, you can't restore it. But something to think about, the salt that they use is usually more like the Dead Sea salt. It's not pure and therefore could become tasteless. So once salt has lost its flavor, it is of no use. So the point of the analogy of salt is that the disciple is defined by his or her relationship to Jesus. If one gives up that relationship, one is like salt that has lost its saltiness. It is of no use. The call for those who have ears is to hear is a call to decision. The reversal of the coming kingdom have been dramatically illustrated. The conditions of discipleship have been set forth, and the consequence of rejecting the call to discipleship have been made clear. Now is the time for a decision. Wow. So Jesus tells us that our nature, our life with God is so different from what the world teaches us. And we are called to make a decision, to be salty for Jesus, to be a disciple who continues to bring seasoning, to bring the good news to the world. Jesus is calling for his disciples, those who have been following him and the 12, to make their decision. Let anyone with ears to hear listen. Let us go back and review the themes that are in Luke and see if those themes are discussed in our readings today. So first, God's redemptive purposes. I would say absolutely. The parable of the great dinner, the great meal, definitely discusses the redemptive purposes, that everyone is invited, but not everyone accepts the invitation. And God will call everyone. And if you accept the invitation, you are welcome to the banquet. If you reject it, then your space will be filled and your opportunity will pass by. How about salvation for all alike? Absolutely. Everyone receives the invitation. Everyone. So salvation is available to all. How about the blessings of poverty and the dangers of wealth? I'm not sure it's that, but I think it does talk about the dangers of protecting social status and with the discussion of humility and hospitality, that there is something powerful in living a life of humility and being honored by God, of being generous in your hospitality so that you can be blessed by God. How about table fellowship? Definitely a discussion. Jesus is at a meal, but then again, the great feast, the discussion of who is invited, is definitely about table fellowship. It's about the fact that the invitation will be sent to all people, that no one is left out. How about the role of a disciple? Definitely, when Jesus talks about counting the cost of discipleship, of being willing and ready to walk away from personal possessions and family and status to follow. And then the importance of an accurate witness. I don't think that was one of Luke's topics here. So as I'd mentioned before, I invite you to go back and explore not only the story of the great meal. Who have you invited? Who have you invited into this great meal? Are you looking for people who have similar social status to yourself, or are you opening this invitation to everyone? And then to go back and look at the cost of discipleship. Have you considered it? Are you ready to be willing when God calls to sacrifice and to step away and to go in a completely new direction? We're going to conclude our study here today. That was a quick run through chapter 14, and there was a lot in there. So if you have any questions, if you need clarification, please reach out to me. On our next episode, we watch as Jesus continues to journey to Jerusalem, and we move to chapter 15. And we'll be doing all of chapter 15, but there's really only 2 parables in chapter 15. The parable of the lost sheep in 15 verses 1 through 10, and the parable of the prodigal and his brother in chapter 15 verses 11 through 32. So that will be our next episode. Again, please comment below if you have questions, thoughts, reflections, things that you wanted to share about what has inspired you or helped you to grow. If you would prefer a more personal conversation, you are welcome to reach to me on my social media or my email, which you will see shortly. As always, blessings and thanks for joining me today. Grace and peace to you, my dear Theophilus. God is with you.